Thank you very much indeed, Christian. If I'd known you were going to read out my tweet, I would have tried to tweet something a little bit more witty and less factual. So I'll try and elaborate a little bit on what you said. But I'm delighted to be here. I'm slightly intimidated because I did originally think that I was speaking at the Zeitgeist conference, which finished last night. And I'm the most untrendy person in the world. So being associated with anything that has the word Zeitgeist in it is slightly scary, and so I'm much happier to be part of the Big Tent event. And I wanted to talk today about some of the biggest policy challenges facing the government when it comes to the internet and what it is that we're trying to do to address those. And I'm very conscious that one of the most dangerous things that you can do in the technology world is try to make any predictions. Mark Twain said that it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. And I'm going to be very rash today and make two big predictions, give you two mantras that I think will define a very important element of the way the technology industry evolves. And before I do that, I need to sort of give a health warning, because when we make predictions in the technology world, we tend to overestimate the short-term impact of changes and underestimate the long-term impact of changes. And just looking at the speakers that you've had today, I think it is interesting that there have been some big predictions that were made about the internet when it started around 15 years ago that have actually turned out to be absolutely right. The first of those is the way that the internet has been a massively disruptive force. If you look at the impact on the newspaper industry, on the music industry, if you look at what's happened to DVD and video rental shops, there is massive disruption that's happening. A Yale professor called Walter Russell Mead said in a book that he wrote called God and Gold that the genius of capitalism was the way that it was able to contain massive disruption without actually causing social upheaval. Well, I believe technology is going to test that theory to distraction, because we have a huge amount that is still to come, much more, I think, than what we've had so far. I think the other prediction that has turned out to be absolutely right, and that we've all noticed this year in particular, has been the way that the internet is a huge force for freedom. And I know you heard Wael Gönül earlier this morning, but it's not just the events in Egypt, it's also in Tunisia, in Syria. It's the internet campaigns in China when people like Ai Weiwei are detained. And it's what's happening in Iran as well. And this, I think, has proved to be one of the most important elements of the internet in countries which have not had freedom of expression in the way that we have done here. And I think as we debate things like privacy laws, it's very, very important to remember the enormous force for good that the internet has been before we rush to legislate when there are things that, that seem to concern us about the way things may be going wrong. But let me move on to my two big rash predictions. And let me give you the first one. And the first one is 4 words, and it is the need for speed. And why do I think the need for speed is incredibly important? Well, the UK has a huge opportunity when it comes to the internet. I would argue, we have an opportunity that is greater than France or Germany or Sweden or Japan, or pretty much any country in the world except for the United States, because we are one of the best countries in the world at the creation of digital content. We have one of the largest film industries in the world. We're the second largest music exporter in the world. We have the largest independent television production sector in the world. And the internet, for a country that is good at the creation of digital content, the internet is effectively a new global trade route, making it possible for us to buy and sell our products all over the world at the click of a mouse. And that is a huge opportunity for us. But we also have a very big problem over our internet speeds. Average speed at the moment is 6.2 meg according to Ofcom. That is actually 26th in the world. So 25 major economies have faster internet speeds than us. If you compare us to the best in the world, South Korea, about 1 in 5 people have access to more than 5 meg at the moment, compared to 3 in 5 in South Korea. And that is going to hold us back seriously. And to illustrate that, I want to tell you the story of someone who is the great-great-grandson of one of the speakers that you heard this morning, Peter Bazalgette, who's actually sitting in the back row and was discussing internet privacy earlier. And Peter's great-great-grandfather, Joseph Bazalgette, was born in 1819. And I hope Peter won't mind me for saying this, but Joseph Bazalgette was probably not set out for great things in life. He was a fairly lowly engineer on the railways at the time of great expansion of the railways. And then in 1849, he rose to the position, the mighty position of assistant surveyor for the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers. So he was working for the London sewage network. Now, the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers had not covered itself in glory when he joined, because they had recently banned the use of cesspits and made it compulsory to pump sewage into a main system and out into the River Thames. And as a result of that, there had been a cholera epidemic that had killed 14,000 people. And 4 years after Joseph Bazalgette joined the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers, there was another outbreak of cholera. This time 11,000 people were killed. And then it got even worse, because in 1858, they had what became known as the Great Stink, when there was this appalling smell that permeated the whole of London. And the effects were so disastrous that the courts were drawing up plans to move outside London. Parliament, they couldn't open the windows, and they had to drape the curtains in lime in order to deal with the smell. And finally, MPs legislated to deal with this problem that all the sewers in London had to be covered. And this was the moment for Joseph Bazalgette, because he had the challenge of building 1,100 miles of covered sewers in London. And he had to make an absolutely huge decision, which was the width of the pipes. And he could have done the logical and the most cost-effective thing. He could have said, well, where is it that we have the greatest density of population? We'll have some bigger pipes there. Where do we have not so many people, the outlying parts of London, even some of the villages, let's have smaller pipes there. He could have done all of that, instead of which he went to the most densely populated area of London. He looked at the diameter of pipe that would be needed to deal with the sewage from that area. And then for good measure, he doubled it. And he said, that's the width we're going to have for all 1,100 miles. And the result of that decision is that now, over 150 years later, his great-great-grandson is still using the same sewage pipes that his great-great-grandfather built, as indeed we all are. And you know, what was inspiring about that decision was that, incidentally, two things. It was prompted by a disruptive change in technology. The Great Stink was prompted by a change in technology, which was the move from using bedpans to using flush toilets. And that was what caused this big increase in sewage going into the system. But the second thing was that one of the things that Joseph Bazalgette couldn't have predicted was another massive change in the way cities work, which was something of big, big significance for sewage, which is the emergence of tower blocks. But because of that extra capacity he built into the system, the sewage system that we have was able to cope even with the arrival of tower blocks. So, you know, you're going to tell me if I'm relating this to the broadband agenda that I'm talking crap. Sorry, I had to say that. But actually, there is real significance, because right now we are having to make the same call about the superfast broadband network that we put in place. And there are countries in the world that are thinking the way that Joseph Bazalgette thought. For example, Singapore. To connect a fiber connection to every single house in Singapore and every single apartment, and they have a lot of apartments in Singapore, which makes it easier for them. To do that, you need a thin tube. And in Singapore, they are doing that, and they want to be the first country in the world which has universal connection to a 1 gig network. But they aren't just connecting one tube, they're connecting a bigger pipe, which actually has room for 6 tubes. So there are actually going to be 5 empty tubes connecting every single home in Singapore, just because they want to make sure that whatever they do is future-proofed and ready to take account of those unexpected tower blocks, disruptive changes in technology, and so on. And so that is why, you know, when people say, why are we doing this when we don't, at the moment, you know, most applications don't need more than 3, 4, or 5 meg. Why are we planning for a 1 gigabyte future? The answer is very straightforward. We don't know what the future will hold, and we can't know what the future will hold, but we do know that there is going to be a massive demand for increased speed, and we need to be ready for it. So the need for speed is my first mantra, and let me say that in a time of great fiscal austerity, this has been a big challenge to make this argument, but we have actually made some good progress in the last year. The amount of money that's been put aside for superfast broadband has increased in the last year from 230 million to 830 million. I've announced the ambition that we should have the best superfast broadband network in Europe. We've announced plans for an East London tech park, which we're hoping to attract tech investors from all over the world, including, who knows, Google. Last week, I announced the ambition that 90% of the country should have access to superfast broadband by 2015. Now, that is a fairly cautious definition of what superfast broadband is. And I think we should be careful about defining a speed level, because what's super fast today will be super slow tomorrow. But we do have very, very big ambitions. But we won't fulfill those ambitions unless we remember the second prediction, the second mantra that I want to give you today, which, unlike the need for speed, which is 4 words, this is even shorter. This is 3 words. And the 3 words are, must be mobile. I know Eric Schmidt, when he was talking to you earlier, was talking about his view of the central importance of the mobile agenda. Mary Meeker, the respected Wall Street analyst, said that, made a prediction last year that by 2012, sales of smartphones and tablets would outstrip PC sales. And in fact, that prediction happened last December. And in fact, last year's sales of smartphones doubled. This year, sales of tablets are expected to quadruple. And if you just look at what's happening here in the UK, a year ago, Ofcom was saying that 18% of people had used a mobile to access the internet. That's now increased to 32% of people. And the point I wanted to make about this, in terms of the way the debate needs to move on, is that this is not about a choice between investing in fixed line and investing in mobile. The two are totally complementary. We have to assume, as we are improving our fixed line capacity with fiber, that the end point, as far as a consumer is concerned, will be a mobile device of some sort or another. But likewise, because the capacity of the airwaves is limited by physical geography, if we're going to cope with a massive increase in the use of smartphones, then we need to make sure that we get those signals to a fixed line high-speed connection as quickly as possible if we're going to have the mobile ubiquity that we need. So the need for speed must be mobile. And if you put those two together, you open the door to one of the most exciting developments that the internet holds in store for us, which is something that Professor David Gann of Imperial College calls, tantalizingly, the Internet of Things. But this is the idea of putting internet-connected chips in everyday objects in a way that really hasn't started to happen. I mean, imagine if you had a heart condition and someone could put a chip in your heart that actually monitored your heart's activity and was able to let a doctor know before you had a stroke or a heart attack. Imagine how that would transform science. Imagine if you were booking a parking space and you were able to book it online before you left home, think of the carbon emissions you would save from people not driving around and around trying to find a parking space, but actually being able to go straight to where they knew they had a pre-booked space. These are just some of the massive changes that will happen. Both of them need speed, and they need a mobile internet to be possible. So Shakespeare said it's not in the stars to control our destiny, but in ourselves. And it is really up to us in this country if we want to play a leading role in the extraordinary things that are about to happen. But we are absolutely determined that that should be the case. We recognize that there are huge challenges of infrastructure, huge challenges of the people who live in the most remote locations, huge challenges with the 9 million people who've never accessed the internet as compared to the 30 million of us who access it every day. But there are also huge opportunities. And if we get this right, we should remember that Joseph Bazalgette secured his place in history by laying pipes that were good enough, not just for his children and grandchildren, but for his great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren as well. Thank you very much.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, it's over to you, but I just want to kick off, Jeremy, by asking you what you think of David Davis's comments today. Now, he has said superfast broadband is an absolute must, but that there is market failure, the marketplace will not provide it, and it's too much for the government to afford. Yet, he then says, he sort of compares what we should do with Roosevelt's New Deal, and seems to suggest that all the unemployed should be put to work building superfast broadband across Britain. What do you think of his idea?
Well, yeah, I think you've slightly overstated it.
Well, I can quote it if you like.
But I think, no, I think we should look at it. I mean, his point, I think, is absolutely right. We have got to have this, and the market isn't going to deliver it on its own, because in the end, you know, the infrastructure defines the market rather than the market defining the infrastructure. And so if we want these kind of exciting things to be happening in this country, we have to have the infrastructure, and then they will start to happen. I mean, whether it's possible for, under Ian Duncan Smith's welfare reform plans, we will be, you know, encouraging people to take much more proactive steps to look for work than they have in the past. And if broadband rollout can be a part of that, then I would welcome that. But I think it's very early days for that. And I think the first thing that we have to establish, and this is the argument that I want to make this afternoon, is that this is something that we really need to be saying is a central objective for our country.
Okay, who'd like to kick off? Yes, in the front, and then could we get a microphone over there as well, please? If you're able, if it's easy, if you could stand and tell us your name and all the rest of it, that would help people at the back.
Jeremy, hi. It's your former constituent, William Heath. You touched on content, and that's obviously really important for us in the UK. I wonder what your comments were about the Hargreaves report and what it said about the copyright regime in the UK and how that compares with what we've currently got with the Digital Economy Act.
Well, I think the Hargreaves report has got some extremely powerful and interesting analysis. And I think what Ian Hargreaves is trying to do in that report is essentially trying to say, let's make it easier for people who want to trial new business models to do so legally by making it easier for them to find out how they can acquire the rights to digital content that they don't have, which is why he talks about digital rights database. And then if we do that, it is then reasonable to crack down harder on piracy and people who are abusing intellectual property rights. So I think he gets that balance right. The other thing I think is good about it is that he just says this isn't a database that he wants the government to set up, it's for the industry to set up. And I think that if we follow the direction of travel that he outlines, it could be an opportunity for the creators of digital content, because it could make it much, much easier for them to get a financial return for the investment they've made. So I'm hopeful that there's a really good way forward with it.
Yes.
James Deacon?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, my question's fairly simple to ask and probably difficult to answer, but you just mentioned that industry alone isn't going to fund the rollout of superfast internet connections across the country, and it seems hard to imagine how the government would, produce that level of investment. How do we do this then? Because I think very few people in this room would argue with the fact that we need to. Well,
the investment gap at the moment, if you're looking at fibre to the home in a typical town or city, it probably costs around £450, and the market would probably pay £150 per household to get fibre to the home. So there is a gap at the moment, and we're looking at ways to reduce that. And I suppose what are we doing? We're first of all trying to reduce the cost of laying superfast broadband by giving broadband providers access to BT's ducts, to telegraph poles, to electricity pylons, to water mains, and Ofcom are doing a huge amount of work to create a regulatory regime to see if we can reduce the cost by doing that. We are also trying to give certainty to investors that the government is totally committed to this. I've got 6 cabinet ministers this year giving speeches about superfast broadband and how it's directly going to impact on their agenda. Ian Duncan Smith has said, for example, that the universal benefit, the universal credit, his big welfare reform, will only be able to be accessed through an online application form. And he's going to make sure that he provides the training and coaching necessary for people who need it to make sure that they can do that. So that's also part of it. And then, we are trying to encourage innovation through pilots that we've set up in many different parts of the country to see if there are cheaper ways to do this. But it's a big challenge, and you're right, we don't have all the money in the public purse. But we shouldn't forget that in South Korea, which has the best broadband network in the world, 90% of the investment came from the private sector. Only 10% came from the government, and that was because the government found smart ways to leverage private sector investment, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yes, behind you. Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Paul Burnell from the University of East Anglia. I have a question, something you didn't seem to mention, and I was hoping you would. Net neutrality. Anything to say about it?
Well, we support it. I think one of the most fundamentally important points about the internet is that it gives opportunities for small people building their own websites, developing their own e-commerce businesses in exactly the same way that it gives opportunities to Tesco's and Marks and Spencer's, and I think that's really important. I think it's less of an issue in this country than it is in the United States, because we have, I talked about our broadband market in slightly disparaging terms in terms of speed, but actually we do very well in terms of price, and we have a very competitive broadband market with a large choice of ISPs. So I think it would be difficult for ISPs if they try to undermine net neutrality by giving favor to big players like the iPlayer or Google or whoever. But, yes, we support the principles behind net neutrality.
Who else? Yes, there's a hand up in the middle. Just hang on till the microphone gets to you. And then John Kampner in the front there.
Hello, my name is Jack Gavigan. Going back to the Digital Economy Act theme, when will the parliamentary inquiry into the protection of intellectual online property rights resume?
Well, we've had so many inquiries into... Are you talking about the implementation of the Digital Economy Act? You are, right. Well, we are going through a process now of finding out the best way to implement the Digital Economy Act. We intend to implement it in a way that is consistent with the direction of travel of the Hargreaves Review that's been published today. As you know, it was rushed through Parliament, and there were parts of that legislation that needed a lot more thought than they had, particularly around site blocking. And so I've asked Ofcom to do a report, an independent report, on whether, in fact, the site blocking proposals are technically feasible, and I'm expecting that report to come back in the next few weeks. And I hope that by the time we go away for our summer holidays, we will have been able to publish our plans, both for taking the Hargreaves Review forward and for the implementation of the Digital Economy Act.
Yes, John.
John Kampner, Index on Censorship. Jeremy, too good an opportunity not to ambush you, and at the risk of preempting our next session, what's your view on the proliferation of super injunctions and, more to the point, anonymized injunctions, and who's entitled to privacy with regard to their private life, and what kind of privacy?
Well, the technology has made a bit of an ass of the law, basically, and we have this, I think, very unfortunate and unsustainable situation where newspapers are not able to print things that are freely available on the internet. And my view is, and that's why I did allude to this in my earlier comments, I think we have to remember the internet has been a huge force for freedom, and remember that before we start going in with big ambitions to clamp down on this bit of the internet or that bit of the internet. The point I would make is that the law as it's being interpreted by judges would appear to be inconsistent with what Parliament decided when it implemented the Human Rights Act, because Parliament was very clear that if there was a conflict between the article which enshrines privacy with the article that enshrines freedom of expression, the pendulum should tilt towards freedom of expression. Now, in some, arguably not all cases, but in some cases, that has not been reflected in the decisions the courts have made. So we're looking into this at the moment. We don't have a solution. It's not an easy thing. I shall be meeting with Ken Clarke, who's technically whose area it is as Secretary of State for Justice. And we're trying to find a way forward that makes sure that we get the balance right so that we really do protect the freedom of expression, which is of fundamental importance to the way our democracy works.
Do you think there is any responsibility on the part of Google, Facebook, Twitter, to obey the spirit of any of these injunctions, so that you shouldn't be able to just type in footballer super injunction and come up with a name?
I think it's more complicated than that, because sites like Twitter argue that they are a mere conduit. They're the vehicle through which, I mean, they would say it's like trying to punish BT if two criminals plot bank robbery using a phone line. And so it's a little bit more complicated when you've got sites that are basically publishing unmoderated content. There are obviously other sites, I know you're going to hear from Mumsnet later, which does moderate the content on its site. And I'm not someone who takes an absolutist view that they have no responsibility for the content on their site. I think my basic position on this is that they need to be socially responsible. They need to make sure that their customers are also citizens, and they need to make sure that they behave in a socially responsible way that respects the aspirations of citizens.
What is social responsibility is the trouble, isn't it? As you say, when you've got something as huge as a thing like Twitter or Google, how you actually go out and filter these things out is impossible, practically speaking, isn't it?
It is, and I think it is. That's why I think we need to make a clear distinction between sites that are able to moderate and sites that have clearly been set up in a way that they aren't. So I think it's complicated legal territory, and I think one thing's very clear is that the law has not caught up with changes in technology, and that's why we need to have a big think about how we're going to take things forward.
Yes.
It's just alongside, so Nigel Dacre from Inclusive Digital, just alongside the 2 points you're making about fast broadband speeds and going mobile, how do those interact in your mind with local media? And indeed, where are you in your thinking now on local media in general?
Well, as you will know, Nigel, I've always been a very, very big supporter of local media, and in particular, I think it is we have some of the best broadcasting in the world in this country, but perhaps the biggest blot on our landscape is that we don't have decent local TV in this country, and we should. And I'm a localist, and I believe that communities up and down the country would be transformed if they had local TV. And so I'm trying to find a way of nurturing a new local TV sector. And I think, how does it interrelate with the agenda I've talked about? Well, very simply, if we have super fast broadband, then the transmission costs for a new TV station fall to zero. When we have IPTV, we'll have the chaos of the internet in our living room televisions. And of course, that will mean that there can be any number of local TV stations. So I think it'll be immensely helpful for local media. But I want to do something before that happens as well, which is why I'm looking to see if under current DTT structures, it's possible to license some local TV stations, and we're doing everything we can to try and make that happen.
Yes.
Glyn Wintle, Open Rights Group. Following on from the DIAT question earlier on site blocking, I imagine it's entirely possible to make it difficult to connect to a website, and I imagine that's what the report will come back and tell you. But do you think it would be acceptable if someone reported a site like WikiLeaks of containing copyrighted material, which I think it does contain, and said, could you please block that? Do you think the law should, as it currently stands, would actually cause that to be blocked? Or do you think that should be changed?
Well, you've put your finger on the central question behind the site blocking debate, which is how you decide which sites should be blocked and which sites shouldn't. And there are sites which everyone agrees we should block access to, child porn sites, for example. And there are sites like WikiLeaks where you can have a very big debate, which journalists would say centers around your definition of public interest. And then there are sites that are sort of in the middle, which are sites that promote illegal downloading of music and film content. And I think that's one of the challenges in the implementation of the site blocking part of the Digital Economy Act, is how you make that distinction. And that's one of the things that I'm sure the Ofcom will be telling us about when they come back with their report.
Are you one of the people who thinks WikiLeaks is the force for good bit of the internet or the force for bad?
Well, I didn't think that what WikiLeaks did was a force for good in that particular case, because they compromised some very, very important information and put people's lives at risk. But I do think freedom of expression on the internet is a force for good. And so I think what you have to be careful about is making your views on a particular case suddenly change your views on what should happen in the generality of cases.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Harry Gooding. I was just wondering if you think that the legal system will ever be able to keep up with the evolving technologies that are coming up in the market? And if not, what are we going to do as a society?
Well, the answer is probably not. But we then need to try and make sure that the legal system we have is as adaptable as possible to changes in technology. And, you know, it's already becoming clear that the time span for changing the law makes it very difficult to do that. But what I said in my comments earlier was that I have an aspiration for us to be one of the most successful digital economies in the world. Eric Schmidt is fond of saying that the internet is 7% of our economy, and it should be 10% before 2013, and that we're the biggest spenders per capita on e-commerce in the world. There's a really, really big opportunity for this country, and having a responsive and flexible legal system has got to be one of the things that we aspire to make happen.
Yes.
Jim Killock, also from the Open Rights Group. I'd like to ask, in the case of site blocking, it seems that the discussion is centered around private companies deciding whether to block websites or not for copyright infringement, and this being a private arrangement between the copyright holders and internet service providers, which would then avoid the need for legislation, for instance, and place law-making decisions about what may or may not be seen into the hands of private actors, private companies. Is private companies making law enforcement decisions a desirable outcome in your view?
No, and that's not what we want. But I have to say to you that I don't have a problem with the principle of blocking access to websites that have been set up explicitly to peddle illegally downloaded content. I think that we wouldn't allow a shop to set up in the high street selling stolen goods. And I think it is completely legitimate to say that we should be doing what we can to frustrate the ambitions of people who set up websites specifically designed to promote the dissemination of illegally uncopyrighted or copyrighted material that's being distributed illegally. So I don't have a problem with the principle, but I want to make sure that in practice it's applied in a way that's sensible, fair and proportionate.
Last one on the back.
I've got a question which I hope will connect your interest in superfast broadband with your prior world, your experience in educational publishing. And for the past couple of years, my kids have been set homework to be completed online. I won't name the intelligent tutoring system in question, although it is very good. But some of their classmates don't have internet at home. This worries me. Okay, my kids are fine. I'm still worried. Why is that? Anyway, I know one of them goes to the library to do his homework. Others have to stay at school, a bit like detention, I suppose, to do it in the IT suite there. Okay, so what's that got to do with, so that's the education bit, with superfast? Well, superfast is one way of looking at it. Another way is superfat. In other words, there'll be lots of capacity, never mind the speed. So I was wondering what would you say to the idea of making a certain small fragment of that fat pipe available to free for people on low incomes, in order that they are able to have internet at home so their kids could gain the benefit of these new opportunities for learning?
Well, it's a very interesting idea. And by the way, I think you're absolutely right to talk about capacity as being a reason why we need to make sure that we upgrade our broadband capability. It isn't just about speed, it's also about contention rates. And anyone who's tried to access the internet on a Sunday evening will know how it slows down massively when everyone else is trying to access it at the same time. We have to make sure that this digital revolution is available to everyone. It's fundamentally important. And one of the great insights of the work that Martha Lane Fox has been doing has been to draw to the attention of all of us the fact that the opportunities for the socially disadvantaged are actually much, much higher than for everyone else. They're not lower, they're higher. I mean, if you think about the impact of technology on disabled people, of being able to do your shopping online, not having to go around the shops if you find mobility difficult. If you think about the communication potential for people who are living on their own and might be lonely and isolated. 29% of us live in single-person households at the moment. That's a huge proportion of the population. So I totally agree with you. And I also agree with you that education is a very good starting point for looking at this. When I was in South Korea looking at their broadband network, one of the biggest drivers of superfast take-up was kids being able to do their homework in the evenings. And in fact, one of the reasons why they have got such a fantastic superfast broadband network is because about 40% of the population lives in apartment blocks in South Korea. And they had a big building boom in the 1990s. And Samsung was one of the companies that's involved in the construction business. And they decided they would put superfast links into all their apartments as a sales tool to make their apartments more attractive. And they used it as the slogan, buy a Samsung apartment and make your children more intelligent. And after they did that, of course, everyone then had to have superfast connections in their apartments. And that was part of what got Korea on its way. So I think it's a very good point.
Just on a related issue, I'm going to mention one point from Twitter, because there's one very persistent tweeter who keeps making the point about what about the 10% who aren't part of your 90% by 2015. What are you going to do to reach them?
Well, what I would say is we're not going to help that 10% by slowing down the investment in the 90%. I mean, the way that we will find the money to make sure that investment reaches every corner of the country, which we're absolutely committed to doing, is by making sure we have the biggest and the most successful broadband market in the world, and therefore that ISPs are making money from their broadband connections, they can see the value of connections, and then they are prepared to invest. But there may well be a need for public investment. There's a need for public investment in order to get us to 9 out of 10 of the population being able to access superfast broadband. There will definitely be a need for more public investment to get to that last 10%, but we just have to cross one hurdle, one bridge at a time.
Jeremy Hunt, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.